Welcome to Overheard, the Foreign Policy Research Institute monthly podcast that explores the national security implications of intelligence activities, irregular warfare, and political warfare. My name is Philip Wasielewski, and I'm the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare. Today's podcast is going to turn to the subject of irregular warfare. The Center for the Study of Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare defines irregular warfare as a form of warfare by state or non-state groups in which one side fights another to achieve political goals via indirect methods, such as insurgency, subversion, and terrorism, and the methods used by the other side to defeat that effort. Throughout American history, these have predominantly been the types of wars that we have fought, even though today, most of them and their lessons are forgotten. To discuss this type of warfare, FPRI is extremely fortunate and honored to have as our guest retired Lieutenant General Charles T. Cleveland, U.S. Army. From 2012 to 2015, General Cleveland was the leader of the U.S. Army Special Operations Command, which is responsible for overseeing the Army's various special operations forces. Prior to that, he led the Special Operations Command for Central Command from 2008 to 2011 and was responsible for the conduct of special operations throughout the Central Command theater, including Iraq and Afghanistan. General Cleveland, a West Point graduate, spent 37 years in the Army, almost all of it as a Special Forces officer. His Special Forces career touched almost every continent and numerous combat zones, including probably the most dangerous and ruthless battlefield of all, Washington, D.C. To list all of his assignments and decorations would not leave us any time for our discussion, so suffice it to say, General Cleveland is one of the nation's most experienced warriors in irregular warfare and the author of a memoir, appropriately titled The American Way of Irregular War, published in 2020 by RAND. General, welcome.
Thank you, Phil. I'm pleased to be here.
Well, General, let's dive right into our discussion. There are actually several ways of defining irregular warfare. Based on your years of experience, how would you describe this type of warfare for our audience?
I think FPRI's definition is a good one. It's a good start place. There are academics out there from across the spectrum who have defined it in one way or another, and over time, the definition has morphed with the times as well. Personally, I think we can become too focused on, should the definition include the word violent or not violent? The example there being that, in the DOD instruction, it had, that it was a violent struggle among state and non-state actors for legitimacy and influence over relevant populations. The NDS basically took the word violent out of that, a struggle among state and non-state actors for legitimacy and influence over relevant populations. What was the reason for taking that out? It, I think, appropriately broadened this out. Irregular warfare is not unlike any other form of warfare. In fact, our adversaries oftentimes don't segment off warfare in, traditional and irregular, right? To them, warfare is warfare. Some would say that the Chinese look at it as though, they flip Clausewitz. It's not, politics by other means. It's in fact that politics are war by other means. So I think the adversary in the space that is irregular warfare, the adversary's view is really critical. The adversary's strategy is critical. If the adversary can see you and says, I can achieve my strategic objectives over time using a strategy of attrition, it takes them into using irregular or what we would call asymmetric means to avoid direct, if you will, force on force confrontation. And that leaves a pretty wide space for them to follow a number of lines of operation to achieve their goal, some of which may be violent, some of which may be purely informational. But it's these numbers of lines of operation, in my view, that are important to remember. It is a form of warfare that will take on a bunch of different aspects. It has all the traditional requirements for logistics and intelligence and so forth, but it has this limit to it where your adversary is purposefully staying underneath what I used to call the JTF threshold, right? At least when they're trying to apply it against the United States.
You mean the Joint Task Force
The
threshold
Joint Task Force.
where we
No,
mobilize everything?
yeah, exactly. I mean that, the joint force, this, the construct that DoD has used now for really a couple of decades or more, that the joint force is the thing that we send to go do our warfare, right? And so that's our adversaries have seen what that powerful package can do, and they will either try to stay underneath that threshold, or even if we deploy the JTF, they will employ a tradition or a strategy of attrition, where if they have sanctuary, such as in Afghanistan, where you had the ability to, find yourself safe haven, to recoup and basically wait out the adversary, that becomes their preferred strategy. That, I think, is irregular warfare. So it's much easier defined on the upper end by traditional war. We state on state is traditional war, maneuver units. You win wars by maneuver. You don't win by infiltrations. You don't win traditional wars by infiltration. That's not necessarily the case in irregular war. Irregular war will have probably a number of things that are infiltrated, that are beneath the radar, covert, overt, as you try to push your adversary into a position that you desire them to be in. And so it's less defined than on the peace side of the spectrum, if you want to use a spectrum, where normal interstate competition leaves off, and perhaps the enemy's intent would say that you're engaged in what I would say is now an irregular war.
Thank you, General. And it's interesting. What I found most interesting in your definition is, as you looked at it basically from the enemy side, our opponent's side, is what they wish to use the method of irregular warfare so that in achieving their goals, they don't basically tempt us or force us to deploy the large amount, what you call the JTF, the Joint Task Force, the large combined force of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines to combat them, which is generally bad for them. Now, you have spent your lifetime and in irregular warfare operations, and you also commanded once the U.S. Army, all of the U.S. Army Special Operations Forces. Could you describe for our listeners how the U.S. military, and especially the Army, because it has the majority of the resources for this type of warfare, is configured to conduct irregular warfare? Who's who and what do they do?
Well, the entire Army, just like the entire government, has a role in irregular warfare, just as it does in traditional war. It has, though, tools within the Army that are better suited for that irregular war that I described earlier. It's certainly the branch that I came from, the Special Forces branch, the PSYOP branch, which is very closely aligned with the Special Forces branch, and those units that are associated with that. Segments of the civil affairs community is also, because governance, right? The seeds of instability often come from poor governance. So if you can identify how to improve governance, then that might prevent and help inoculate an area. Or if you are working with a group and you need to form governance in exile, the civil affairs folks that understand governance, that's important. So those are three. Intelligence, obviously, as well. A segment of the intelligence community is obviously has to be focused on what irregular warfare is about, and so conventional forces, in terms of this recently created security force assistance brigades that go to help allies in warfighting at scales above the battalion and brigade level, that can talk about the use of large artillery, cannon, missiles, as well as large logistics challenges. Those advisory elements, I think, are a part of the Army that are also very helpful in irregular war. So we all have a piece of it. Some segments need to be focused on their knitting, which is winning America's traditional wars. Others need to be focused on what they are supposed to do, which is win America's irregular wars.
Could you describe briefly for our listeners the difference between special operations forces within the Army, the different types, and special forces to which you belong to?
Special forces versus special operations forces, or the shorthand being SOF, which is somewhat of an unfortunate, acronym here in my view. SOF came about really about the time SOCOM was created back in the mid 80s, I think, as a term to describe not only the Army special operations capabilities, right, but also to talk about the Navy and the Air Force's special operations capabilities. And so the collective term was they use special operations forces, and so SOF was I think a good acronym to capture everybody under. But that's the full suite of capabilities. Special forces originated in 1952 out of the PSYOP school at what was Fort Bragg at the time. And this was a legacy of the OSS primarily that said, hey, the military has to have a capability as well as the newly created CIA to do these kinds of unconventional warfare operations. And so the 10th Special Forces Group was created back in 1952. That Special Forces capability, the SEALs came on a little bit later in the latter part of the 50s, early 60s, I think. And so you had these individual pockets of soft or special operations capabilities within the services that, again, I think waxed and waned in popularity really along with the Vietnam War. And then it took of course, Desert One and the problems that came after that to eventually force Congress into creating SOCOM, and then SOCOM capturing and hoovering up all of those capabilities up underneath it, created this acronym SOF.
SOCOM being the acronym.
U.S. Special Operations Command, which didn't exist prior to 1987, and which was created by Congress with the basically passage of the Nunn-Cohen Amendment to the Goldwater-Nichols Act that basically said we need to have a focused line of funding and some increased oversight capability and civilian oversight capability within the Department of Defense for these basket of things that we will call special operations, low intensity conflict. And that's where the assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, Low Intensity Conflict, that's when that office basically was created, to help the Secretary with this basket of forces, and MFP-11, the funding stream came with it. Yes.
General, I want to go back to something that I found very interesting in your description of the history of special forces. You mentioned that it came out of the PSYOPs portion of the U.S. Army that had remained from the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, PSYOPs being the shorthand for psychological operations, and that it's still today a separate branch in the U.S. Army, along with civil affairs, which you said one of its missions, civil affairs, is help locals improve governance. These are two key parts of irregular warfare. As a matter of fact, the great author Bernard Fall about the Vietnam War coined a term revolutionary warfare, what the communists were using irregular warfare for. And he saw revolutionary warfare as a fight to see who would govern the best, making civil affairs an important part of the struggle, of the counterinsurgency struggle. Could you give our listeners an idea of how the PSYOPs, Psychological Operations Branch, and Civil Affairs Branch fit into Special Operations Forces, and how these branches, which no one ever kind of thinks about really, are important in the joint operations in irregular warfare?
It is unfortunate that they are somewhat overlooked, frankly, because they are, as you point out, key to solutions to the problem. And of course, every solution to these irregular warfare challenges, or the instability or insurgencies, whatever facet of revolution or counter-revolution that we're participating in, PSYOP and civil affairs or governance and information is it's an incredibly important part of that fight. Just as commerce and the justice system, all those elements of government have to function. If you'll recall, Phil, in Afghanistan, many of the areas that the Taliban had taken over, one of the reasons why the locals out there turned to the Taliban was because their justice was swift. Oftentimes their justice was, in the minds and in the view of the citizenry out there, fair. It wasn't corrupt, right? You didn't have to pay off anybody in order to get your case heard. And so that's important as we figure out how to solve these irregular warfare problems. There is also, though, in all of this, you can't have good governance, and you can't, in a message, and the messaging for PSYOP side of the house is both to counter the messaging of your opponent, but also to promote the messages and the views of your supported government or supported entity. But there's always a security component, which is where the special forces capability comes in. And so you have to have those things. They have to be seen working, in my view, together. In some early stages, it could be the very dominant on the security side, right? You have to set the conditions for governance to actually take hold. You have to have a positive message in that process. And while PSYOP helps you in everything from warning citizens, perhaps, and messaging citizens, but in affected areas, to also getting across the government's message, to as well promoting the idea that, you know, the forces that are there are to be respected, but they're also part of the friendlies, right? And so you have to have all of those things working together. I think shortly thereafter, you also have to have the ability for commerce and be able to facilitate business. Some of that is what civil affairs does as well, is bring in NGOs perhaps to do some initial healing. And then as soon as possible thereafter, you try to bring in some capability to actually get military males a meaningful job so that they can support their families, so that they don't have to turn to perhaps insurgency. So anyway, that's why those three branches, frankly, constitute American, or the Army's, special warfare capability, which I think is those forces that are regionally aligned. Oftentimes they know the language, they study or should be studying the backgrounds and the situations in each one of the target areas. And then when they're called in, then they can work with the indigenous peoples to fashion solutions. And if I will, let me just add at this point, special operations forces, they come in two parts, really. Think of it this way. The special operations commando capability, which best is seen by the Rangers and to some degree the raiding forces that, you saw go in to take Osama bin Laden down. This is the perfected raid, right? Now, all units in the military conduct raids. They're just, some are messier than others, frankly, right? Artillery do raids, right? It's just that the special operations forces have created an architecture that allows for surgical application of force. And that's why we in our early formulation of ADP 3.05 in the Army's doctrinal pub, said those are surgical strike forces. They do a little more than that, but that's kind of a good way to capture. On the other side is you have this force that's dedicated towards use of indigenous assets that rely on language and deep knowledge and interpersonal relations, so that you can establish a rapport, and in the process, hopefully gain some support for joint application of indigenous assets and U.S. assets to solve a mutual problem. And the way I used to talk about that is to say, you have to squeeze out uncertainty before you conduct a raid, and you get as much of it out of that as possible. Then you apply your force using McCraven's, well-known formula of, speed and surprise to give you advantage. And then on the objective, you have operators who are very, very good at discerning friend, foe, and doing what they need to do on the objective. None better, frankly, than those of the United States. On the other side of the equation, you have forces that are designed to actually, because there are situations where you have to wade into uncertainty. You don't know how Mam Jalal Talabani is going to react or that, the leftover of the Northern Alliance is going to react when you come in. You don't necessarily know friend or foe at that time, right? And so that wading into uncertainty is what this other side of the special operations community does. They build themselves so that they, as an A team, as an example, you have a medic, you have an engineer, you have a commo guy, you have all internal assets that allow you to survive in the middle of the uncertainty. And they are also good at warfare. They are also good at killing when they need to kill. But the idea for them is to get in, work with the indigenous, and solve the problem, and many times from the inside out. And I think that's the two key differences between the halves of our U.S. Special Operations capability. And while we have a world-class capability on the rating side, we have tactical assets that are world-class on the special warfare side. We are deficient, in my view, on at the operational and strategic level, though, on this irregular warfare side.
As I mentioned in the introduction, you wrote a memoir that covered your time in special forces, which I thought you just, in your description here, the differences of special operations forces, just gave a great description of SF as its use of language, knowledge, and interpersonal relations go about doing their job, and how that these A teams are built and trained to deal with ambiguity and to work with indigenous forces. Your memoir covers your time from being an A team leader, young captain in charge of 12 Special Forces NCOs, to being in charge of all of the Army Special Operations Forces. What motivated you to write this memoir, and what are the lessons that you've learned about irregular warfare that you cover in your book?
Well, first, I want to say, I did not set out to write this memoir, but on my run up to retirement and immediately after retirement, I had a friend worked at RAND, Linda Robinson, who wrote about the Special Forces community, the Special Operations community, had gained a lot of credibility, has a lot of credibility within the military and within the Special Operations community. And I would often talk to her about what I saw as the deficiencies in our approach to this. And I would, in those conversations, harken back to, and I remember when, right, as we old warriors are wont to do, right? Everything's a war story. She encouraged me to consider asking for a Smith Richardson grant to actually write something, to do some analysis and try to point out my observations through a study. And Nadia Shadlow, she introduced me to Nadia. We had lunch. I submitted a proposal, and thanks to their support, it was approved. And we elected then through RAND, where I was working as an adjunct, to go ahead and write a report, not a book, but a RAND report. It's free, downloadable. You don't have to pay anything. And I toyed with using historical examples, and then I decided on I'm just going to say what I saw, and kind of with the benefit of 37 years, look back at what I might have seen when I was, a young captain, and try to put it in context. And so that's what the analytical memoir is about. I was given a RAND researcher by the name of Daniel Eagle, who is now a good family friend, a tremendously talented researcher and writer. And I would say that anybody that picks up this book, the good parts are Daniel's. Okay, so let me just say that. So that's what motivated me to write it. The first part of this report is, I think you gather pretty much everything you need to know from the preface through basically the summary, and perhaps if you want to get into the introduction of the book, and then after that, chapter 2 and on, I basically just talk about kind of my career, and then I end it with recommendations, a little more in-depth explanation of the recommendations that you see in the summary to basically to the military, to the president, and Congress, and then to the American people. Because at the end of the day, my frustration over the years had been that watching senior leaders in the militaries, in the special operations side, the SF side in particular, which was frankly not very popular or well supported, for a long period of time. But I watched good meaning leaders who had come up and did everything they could as a 1-star and 2-star and then the odd 3-star that get promoted, and just see that their efforts were just not enough, right? And they're ephemeral in many cases. And the things they built, while maybe good at the time, never lasted long beyond the next change of watch. So it drove me to the conclusion that if there was going to be change, it had to go back to Congress. It had to be something that the president and needed to be involved in, or at least certainly the very senior parts of the executive branch. And honestly, the American people also need to have a stake in this, because the solution to these problems, and I think increasingly so even today, rests with being able to hold government to account. I think, if you take a look at Afghanistan and what happened in the aftermath, there is just now a dawning of, okay, do we hold somebody to account? What did we really learn in the way we handled Afghanistan? What do we really learn about the way we approached Iraq in 2003? Was there not maybe a different way that we could approach both of those problems that wouldn't have resulted in trillions of dollars spent and tens of thousands of young lives, negatively impacted? And so that's what prompted the book or the memoir, the report.
At the end there, you were talking about how we approach these problems and looking at it in retrospect. I'd like to ask a couple of retrospective questions about approach to problems, more at the kind of the tactical level from early in your career, and then we can get to at the Congress and the National Security Council level later on in our discussion. When you were a young captain, and man, we were all young when we were captains, you participated in counter-narcotics operations in Bolivia. And in your memoir, you discussed lessons learned at the tactical level regarding population-centric warfare. Could you provide our listeners with some of your insights from that period of your career? And what is population-centric warfare? Because I think it's key to understanding irregular warfare, or certainly insurgency and counterinsurgency.
Yeah, I mean, my takeaway from the Bolivia experience, and a little bit Peru afterwards, with as the team started to conduct special or counter narcotics missions in South America, elsewhere, it became very evident early on that this was a long term issue. This was a issue much bigger than our team in the Chapari. So we had to, our notion of success had to be different than as a captain. When you're in a normal firefight or not, you have pretty definitive sorts of measures of success, right? Measures of success in this, you had to create your own. There were no book on it. We were the first ones to go to Bolivia, so we had to somewhat come up with our own.
And Chapari was a section of Bolivia you were in.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, Chapari was kind of the upper Amazon river basin in the very foothills of the Andes Mountains, from Cochabamba as it descended into the jungle region that was at the headwaters of of one of the major sets of tributaries to eventually the Amazon. And it was a great coca growing region, right? And coca from the hills had transplanted down into this area, and where you had running water, you had the right kind of conditions to grow the coca plant, and the Colombians had seized on this, the organic homegrown coca plant, and created some varieties that were very resilient and were growing it really unimpeded down in this area, supporting the cocaine habits in the United States. So we went there. We weren't going to solve that problem, but what we decided was our best bet was to, at the team level, disrupt what had become kind of an equilibrium between the local police that were taking money, the drug cartels that were, of course, using the local police, and frankly, the U.S. government that had entities down there that were trying to, they had pet projects and things that, the crop substitution, initiative. They had, DEA was doing its best down there to try to build a capability and fight drug trafficking on a massive scale. And so But this equilibrium, everybody had become pretty comfortable in it, and our objective became we have to disrupt the equilibrium to see where there might be opportunity. And quickly, as we got into the operation, I realized, these people here are just doing what they can to make a living, right? Because of the drug trade, they had depopulated a lot of towns up in the Altiplano, the high mountain area of Bolivia, and these people had sought the gold rush and gone down to the lowlands to live in conditions that they weren't used to, that weren't their historical, homelands up in the mountains. Tremendous disruption to that economy. And of course, induced its own human misery by transplanting them into this, in many cases, disease ridden sorts of area that they weren't used to, nor was there an infrastructure to support. So, what motivated somebody to go down there was essential in understanding. I mean, it had to be pretty dire for them to seek this. So, the problems really were bigger than just in the Chapare. It was with the government, to no small degree in Bolivia, as well as the consumption of drugs up in the United States, which created this distortion. And so the other part of this was our counterparts, the Bolivian National Police, who, again, they don't make much money. And for a young, if you will, private equivalent out on a simple checkpoint, he could make in a day essentially a month's wages by just looking the other way and taking a payoff at a gate. Again, you have to, and then you say, well, why do the officers in this organization do that? Don't they have any loyalty to government? Well, if governments seem to be involved in the corruption, it's hard for them to have loyalty to that. So us as advisors coming in, expecting and mirror imaging to say, you need to be, stamping out this corruption at the lowest level. It creates its own tensions and problem, right?
Right.
Now, how do you get around that? We proposed, hey, we need to have a U.S. supported insurance program for these officers, so they do risk their lives. They understand their families are going to be taken care of. Try to figure out some way to give assurance to them. But it was a tough problem. It was an interagency challenge, interagency environment, and I loved it. Frankly, there was no book on it. You did the best you could in the situation, and that mission lasted from when we started it in '87. I mean, I think mid '90s, I guess, that operation was still going on with teams following in behind us, which is another part of where irregular warfare, I think, differs from traditional war, is that it has its own timeline, its own operational timeline. And unlike traditional war, where the physics of war matter, right? The Iron Mountain, how big the Iron Mountain is, artillery shells and all this other kind of stuff. Or the equation of a surge, let's say, as an example, where if you double the amount of troops and double the amount of money you invest in a problem set like Afghanistan, the hope is maybe you half the amount of time it takes to achieve what you're trying to achieve. When in fact, what happens is just the opposite. You distort the local economy. You actually create a level of corruption that is seen as, just an anathema to the lower, to the people below it. And again, all well-meaning, right? But that's taking a traditional war physics approach to irregular war, and where it actually then created, I think, a bigger problem. Whereas, we become increasingly the occupier, increasingly the object of the insurgency, and we just burrow deeper and deeper into it owning the problem, vice helping them through the problem.
By the way, for our listeners, it's my understanding you're not a bad Spanish speaker, correct?
I speak Spanish. 2.5 years in Caracas. My dad was in the mill group down there when I was 10 to 12. That's a great age to learn a language, right?
The reason I ask is because earlier, again, you'd been talking about special forces as, combining the use of language, deep area knowledge, and interpersonal relations. And I saw that, and as I was listening to your description of how you basically did an analysis of the population Your analysis looked at the people, not just the problem of cocoa growing, but why it was being grown, who was growing from it, who was benefiting from it, why they were benefiting from it, and then took and proceeded and did your operations accordingly. This is one of the hallmarks of special forces, of people who are trained to work, with indigenous forces and through them, as opposed to doing it all on ourselves. I want to segue to your next assignment, which was in El Salvador, which was a counterinsurgency operation. Now, many of our listeners may not remember this war, which was controversial at the time, but our efforts there in the 1980s were quite successful. Many believe because we actually had only a small footprint in the country, and those in the country did speak the language, did know the area. Could you discuss your perspective of conducting a counterinsurgency campaign with only a limited amount of U.S. military personnel in the country? I mean, the number of people permanently there in uniform was 55, with some others who could rotate in temporarily. And it was a number that Congress kept a very strict control on. So what is your perspective from moving from Bolivia to El Salvador?
I would say, first of all, I'm not an expert on El Salvador. I went in and out of there a few times, spent and had a mission in there. But we had members of, my little battalion, our little battalion down in Panama, the forward deployed Special Forces Battalion that was working out of the Canal Zone at Fort Davis at that point. We had people that had been in and out of NCOs, and at that point, some warrants who had been in and out of El Salvador on multiple occasions, had deep relationships with the El Sal military, had seen, captains getting promoted to major, lieutenant colonel, battalion commanders, had been with them, in their rise through the ranks. And that long-term contact was, I think, critical. In fact, they credited when the peace, Kevin Higgins, who was one of the premier special forces officers in the El Salvador fight and in the Plan Colombia implementation to follow, was there. And one of the things that was credited that the FMLN, I guess, credited,
which were the Salvadoran guerrillas supported
right,
by
Salvadoran guerrillas,
in Nicaragua.
when they finally came to the peace table, they credited the arrival, if you will, of the Special Forces advisors as being a turning point in it. And oddly enough, not because what expertise they brought to the war fighting, although that was a good part of it, it was because the presence started the professionalization of that force, right? And in particular, back to this population-centric idea, this was a population-centric problem. The population was the sea, as Mao said, within which the insurgents were swimming. And the government was having a hard time basically winning over the population. And to no small part because it was abusing the population. And that population, the abuse of the population reduced dramatically with the presence of American advisors. And this presence mission, often derided, is important, right? It gives the U.S. government optionality. It allows, and again, we have a hard time putting a value on this transference of values, but I think in many cases it's important. And that's, again, kind of what Special Forces is about. And of course, part of that is a PSYOP team is helping with that messaging and trying to make it understood. And then a CA element is trying to also help, in these local defense, situations that governance actually is doing what it needs to do. And so it was these small local victories and this idea of professionalization and the reduction of human rights abuses, by a government that was trying to do what the Brits had done in essence in Malaysia, right? Which is tactics were very brutal to succeed in counterinsurgency. And that's the playbook that a lot of governments brought into their warfight with insurgents. The U.S. key to success was to figure out how to form an alternative approach without brutalizing the population. And it's harder and it takes longer. But in today's internet age, it is absolutely essential.
Let's turn to today's age. Today, the Department of Defense is concentrating on facing threats such as Russia or China, and the war in Ukraine is showing us that our industrial base needs to be expanded to fight major conventional wars. However, at the same time, we've either cut or are planning to cut certain irregular warfare capabilities. General, what role do you believe irregular warfare may play in the future for U.S. national security?
I think we're entering the age of proxy war. And in proxy war, whether that proxy is a terrorist or a terrorist group, or that proxy are is a nation that's a failed nation perhaps, or is one that is corrupt and can be manipulated and used, both sides have got to engage in and understand that this is part of the situation. I mean, it's the operational environment that we're in. And irregular war is what essentially proxy war in most of its forms is about, right? And so I think it's more important now. And I worry that we can't become like little kids soccer, right? And everybody rush to the ball, which is maybe the Taiwan problem or even the Ukraine problem. I think what you see with Yemen, right, as the Yemenis, at the prompting of their Iranian masters, are conducting operations to try to impede traffic in through the Red Sea and distorting, if you will, Western economies by, causing their move huge amounts of commercial traffic elsewhere based on a war in Gaza. It's a good example of this proxy war problem that we're going to have to contend with, and where Special Forces does its work, and where all of the irregular warfare assets of the United States, certainly the tactical ones that currently exist, where we all do our best work is in that space. And while the conventional force and the big Navy, big Army need to focus on Taiwan and war with the Chinese or with the Russians, they're going to fight us. Again, going back to where we started, the enemy is going to elect the death by 1,000 cuts over 1,000 years, if necessary, to do what they need to do. And I think we have to be in that field of competition as well, being not only defensive, but frankly, at some point being offensive, and taking our irregular warfare means trying to achieve our interests proactively and in countering them.
Do you have any final thoughts regarding the lessons you have learned as a practitioner of irregular warfare for several decades, especially as you mentioned a little bit earlier about structural issues that are more of the domain of the Pentagon, the Congress, or the National Security Council?
Well, Phil, since you were at the National Security Council and know it far better than I do, I probably should ask you. What do you think we ought to be doing next year? I do think that we are structured poorly for our current fight, and I struggle with how do you get to the structure we need. I've tried to, I don't say prompt Congress, but I've tried to see if Congress couldn't take on some sort of change imposed on the Department of Defense, asking, and there are a lot of people out there. Jim Locker's has tried this idea of maybe we need a new Goldwater Nichols, and maybe that's the case. I more modestly just thought, well, maybe the first part of the problem is to study the problem, which is why I applaud FPRI's bringing you on to this center that you're starting, because it all starts with education and understanding what the problem really is and being able to articulate it. And I think that was where I wanted to put my eggs. So the Irregular Warfare Center in that basket, if you will. So I'm a little critical about the current effort because I think they're maybe missing an opportunity here by putting it at the Defense Security Cooperation University. But wherever it goes, I hope it is a success, and we'll do what I can to make it a success. But it needs to do three things, and FPRI can help in this because FPRI is doing a couple of those things. And one is it needs to do research. Secondly, it needs to educate. And third, the hardest for it to do, and what probably needs to come from something not in government, is critique and provide advisory input to the NSC to Congress, to the Department of Defense, the relevant folks in the Department of Defense. And FPRI can be a part of that. And there are others out there that, frankly, I think are going to be in a position to. And I'm optimistic that we're coming around to understand we got some shortfalls we need to take care of. The biggest shortfall is at the operational and strategic level. We have, if you think about it, when the problem comes up for an irregular warfare problem, we have tactical assets. If it grows, though, beyond what your tactical assets can do, you're immediately into the DoD response is the 18th Airborne Corps in some form, right? That's what happened in Afghanistan after. I often, the thought experiment is, what if we had not deployed the 18th Airborne Corps, but stuck with a heavy CIA Special Forces sort of mission to let organically indigenous capabilities do what they needed to do? Sure, we wouldn't have gotten universal suffrage immediately. Maybe we should have taken a page out of the British book in India. You can't change the Raj, maybe the leadership there at that level, but you can send his son to Sandhurst, and he comes back with a different view of some things that eventually lead to universal suffrage. Irregular warfare has its own time frame, its own timeline. And every time we try to accelerate that is when we wind up, I think, having problems. We don't understand the nature of the conflict, which is what Clausewitz was saying. So that, to me, is where, the Irregular Warfare Center needs to go. I think when Nunn-Cohen Amendment created SOCOM and ASD SOLIC for special operations and low intensity conflict, if you say low intensity conflict is today's irregular warfare, they get an A on what they did for special operations, but they're hovering at C-D on what they did for low intensity conflict. And that's what we need to fix.
Thank you very much, General. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for taking the time to appear on our podcast, for your insights, your wisdom, and sharing with us your lessons learned from 4 decades of waging irregular wars around the world. Thank you.
No, thank you.
We will continue to discuss irregular warfare and its implications for our national security in our next podcast following this one. If you enjoy these podcasts, please visit the Foreign Policy Research Institute website at fpri.org to subscribe to our mailing list and to learn of future overheard podcasts. Thank you for listening to our podcast today, and goodbye.